have to admit that playing new armies in Battlescribe is almost as much of a hobby for me as actually painting and playing with the damn things. I've recently spent a long time agonising over whether Raven Guard Dark Furies, Night Lords Night Raptors, or Blood Angels Dawnbreakers would be a better use of the Rewards of Treachery slot in my Alpha Legion list. And if you ever notice me on the tube, there's a good chance I'll be making a hypothetical new list for a Legion I'll never even play. But I often like to sit and ponder. And once upon a pondering, I decided that when we think about the games we play and why we enjoy them, we attach far too much importance to our armies and the units available to us in those armies. There are, I have wisely decided, far more important things that determine whether a game will actually be fun. So in the absence of Legions Imperialis actually being released yet, I'm going to take the opportunity to put a lot of my vague musings into a more coherent form. I actually want to do 2 videos about this topic. I want to also do a video about how missions and deployment maps actually probably make a bigger difference to our enjoyment than our armies do, at least once our list building reaches a bare minimum level of competence. The issue I want to discuss today, though, is terrain. And not just terrain, but how it all adds up to create a battlefield. There is surprisingly little about this on YouTube, so I might even revisit this if more stuff occurs to me. This is a tough topic to decide where to start, but I think it's important to realise that there are competing factors at play here. Whether it's a competitive or a narrative table will make a huge difference. And whilst you probably can make a table that's good for both, you might have to make too many compromises. I play a lot at Bad Moon Cafe, and I think it's a great venue. But the tables there have become gradually more depressing over time. The number of tables of plain grey MDF terrain with huge targets to mark out where the objectives are makes me sad. I'm not blaming Bad Moon at all, and the other stuff is still available if you want it. They're clearly just responding to customer demand and putting on the tables what their customers want to see. I also don't want to criticise those more competitively minded players. We don't all have to enjoy the game the same way, but that way of playing the game really isn't for me. Also to consider is whether the table can be a permanent feature, dedicated to just one or a few games, or whether it needs to be broken down so the table can be used for other games, or even for family meal times. Then there's questions of storage. I'm lucky enough to have a spare room, overflowing with hobby stuff. You can't even see just off camera, but this room is always a mess. And my wife just about puts up with it. Even that puts a limit on some of my options because I can't store everything. Some people have even worse storage options. There are some incredible terrain builds on the Daka Daka hobby blog section, and I'm really envious of them, but they're only viable if you have a large home or a big outdoor space somewhere. Some friends of mine from Hate Club even have their own workshop and started a company. I swear it's just to justify being able to have some really good games tables, and I don't blame them at all. And finally, cost can't be ignored. Sometimes the most economical plan needs to be the one you accept, even if it means you're not quite as happy with the overall result. And again, some of those builds on Daka Daka and some of what the guys at Illusory Terrain do, it's just not options for most people. Despite all of that, though, there are certain things I think should always be given consideration. And if you do, they'll improve your game experience. The first thing is variety. Now, I've talked a lot in previous videos about the Net Epic campaign that I've been taking part in, organised by my friend Paul. And I've played 7 or 8 recent games, that means. I've found that compared to other games, terrain in Net Epic is a very important consideration when thinking about strategy. Compared to Horus Heresy or 5th edition Warhammer, it's a really big deal. I've used my 30-year-old cardboard buildings in every game I've played so far, and occupying buildings has been a huge part of the game. I've waxed lyrical about blowing buildings up in previous videos, and even when that hasn't happened, they've been a vital element of the gameplay. Occupying them to gain defensive bonuses, positioning objectives, and so on. I found that in one game where that was pretty much the only terrain we had, the game was fun, but it seemed much more one-dimensional. In other games, I've generally also had forests and huge impassable rock formations, climbable hills, and all the different rules interactions they have with our respective armies has made the game a lot more fun. In one game, Peter lent James and I his river, along with a few bridges, and it introduced a totally different dynamic. Some forces had their movement restricted by it, others, notably James's Flyers and my Warhound Titans, just completely ignored it. Now, all of that's a fairly simplistic overview and a way of showing different things you could include. So let's think about how each type of terrain could actually affect your game. And before that, let's consider one thing. We have seen for Legions Imperialis a good summary of the terrain rules already on the Warhammer community site. And it seems like they've primarily broken down the terrain into some catch-all varieties. There's difficult terrain, dangerous terrain, obstructing terrain, and buildings and building-like structures. Now, within each category, they've given examples of things that might belong to that group, but I think we can go a long way by combining or modifying those slightly to create a wider variety of terrain. For example, woodland is given as an example of obstructing terrain, but it also seems sensible that most woodland should be difficult terrain and offer that sort of movement penalty so that only infantry can move through it with ease. And maybe the obstructing part of that rule should only apply when a unit's inside the terrain, not at the very edge. Similarly, dangerous terrain specifies that everything within it takes hits for each inch they move, except for Titans. But I can envisage loose shale prone to landslides on the side of a hill that would potentially be even more dangerous to Titans than it would be to other units. I think even if it's not explicit within the Imperialis rules, we as players can reproduce everything I'm going to talk about now relating back to older versions of the game. So the second topic I want to talk about is line of sight blocking. And that's incredibly important in all war games, 28mm or 6mm. And in this game, I think it can be really, really important for Titan versus Titan conflicts. I think it's mainly because it makes it really important to get your orders correct. Should you go on to first fire and ensure you get your shots in first? What if your primary target moves out of the line of fire, though? You don't want to be left with no worthwhile target for a turn with your main attacking threat. On the other hand, if you go on to advance orders when you don't need to, you might be destroyed before you even get to take your shots. And of course, the same logic applies to other units. They might not be as costly, but you want your shooting units to be positioned differently based on where the LOS blocking terrain is, whereas you want your assault units to try and hug that terrain as you move forwards and minimise how many shots they can, have fired at them. And this actually brings up a closely related topic that I don't want to leave out entirely, but isn't directly related to most of this video, which is Zone Mortalis style boards. I have loved Zone Mortalis games since they were first introduced to 40k, and I love them now still in Necromunda and in Horus Heresy. I think it's partly because the nature of the board sometimes makes up for my main weakness as a player, which I generally think is being bad at deployment. In Epic, it might not make sense to play inside anything less than the most gargantuous of Zone Mortalis complexes or some sort of mass conveyor spaceship, although it does sound fun. But what I can imagine is creating some sort of canyon complex, either a natural one or some sort of artificial one like the surface of a Death Star, but, planet-bound probably. That could definitely be a lot of fun, but I haven't done it yet. Maybe it's something I want to think about trying. Now, moving on from LOS blocking, number 3 is to talk about movement blocking or movement slowing terrain. Now, if terrain is also blocking movement, that's a big difference. Buildings are an incredibly important part of the gameplay in Epic, as I already mentioned. It gives infantry an important advantage over vehicles, and it allows them a large measure of protection at the same time. A rock, or some equivalent to it, such as a gigantic cooling tower at a power station, can still provide that obstacle and therefore be a boon to Titans. But those rocks and power stations are of little discernible use to infantry, except for hiding behind them. Whilst a building or a rock might fill up the same amount of table, they'll each bring something very different to your game. Now, rivers and lakes are almost like anti-buildings. They'll generally allow Titans to enter them, but nothing else, and they don't provide any cover at all. They'll make no difference in a Titan versus Titan fight, but will make movement harder for everything else on the table. Of course, Flyers are the other exception here, making them a very important asset in any list. They'll be able to go wherever they like. Xiphons won't be held back from making their strafing runs. And more importantly, vehicles like Thunderhawk gunships with their transport capacity will be infinitely more valuable. By never having a river or lake in your games, you'd actually be not making people make difficult decisions or careful choices about how to spend their points and overcome those issues. Number 4 is about how terrain affects different units differently. We've touched on that quite a lot already. But one of the most obvious ones for that is woods. Woods in most games tend to affect the movement of everything more or less equally, or just bar some things entirely. And I think that's a shame. It misses a chance to affect different units in different ways. I absolutely love that net epic infantry move through it at full speed, while simultaneously providing full line of sight blocking to the things inside of it. Most line of sight blocking in epic is when there's two things between you, whereas this is just for something you're in. Now, you can generally always shoot at buildings that are in units or in rough terrain, craters, things like that. And the buildings are not regarded as deep enough to protect you from being shot at, and in craters there's nothing above you. Being in a wood is a great way to prevent enemies from targeting your close combat units. And in addition, vehicles and cavalry being at half speed in them robs them of one of their big advantages, putting infantry again at a new advantage they don't normally have. So having woods on your table is a good reason to include plenty of infantry. And again, it's making sure that you can't have a one-track list quite as much as some people might like to. In Net Epic, I've been using a lot of trolls and minotaurs, and although they often have to run across open ground and find cover wherever they can, if there's a nice wood available on the way where I want them to be, I'll almost always send them through it. And I can imagine in this new version of the game, World Eaters fans might be a huge fan of forests and woods, whereas Iron Warriors players might hate the sight of them because they're going to have totally different effects on those two armies. Now, in Net Epic, unlike Space Marine, they made it so that Titans move through woods at full speed instead of half speed. And I think that's a shame. I do get that Titans can bash trees, even a huge sequoia, out of the way as it strides past. But I think they'd have to slow down to do so, or risk tripping themselves or getting caught up in some way. At the very least, if Titans move at high speed through woods, maybe there should be a dangerous terrain roll on their legs or something. Who knows? Anyway, that's just idle chit-chat in the spirit of talking about Legions Imperialis. Rough ground is the same in Space Marine and Net Epic, and it throws up movement penalties for units moving through it and makes them harder to hit. It's kind of like a wood, but not quite as good. In my head, by the way, the hit modifiers, they're not actually just because they're hiding behind things. They're because things are having to slow down and run around things and move in a zigzaggy path. It's why they're both slowed down and easier and harder to hit. Moving in an unpredictable way will do that, which is why roads, which only have rules in Net Epic, speed you up but make you easier to hit. It's pretty damn obvious where you're going to be going, after all, if you're going along a road. And another one that affects different units differently is swamps and marshes. Making them impassable to anything but infantry, and even slowing them down to half speed, might make that patch of ground nothing more than dead space on your battlefield, so it's not something you're going to want a huge amount of. But it might also be the perfect spot to put some shadow swords behind, where it's going to be harder for my trolls to reach them. And what if there was a crucial objective at the centre of the swamp? Now, I'm not sure that a swamp is always going to add much to a game, but in that specific situation, it might turn into the most important bit of terrain on the board that troops are just fed into over and over again, creating, a real zone where a lot of action takes place. That's all a very long-winded way of saying that having a lot of terrain types that affect different units in different ways will make it more interesting to try and get the most out of your units. Do you position things where they'll be most effective based on the terrain? Or will they'll probably face enemy units who in turn will be the things they're most effective against? Maybe your Chaos Dreadnoughts won't have such good lines of fire if positioned opposite a forest, but once the enemy's Minotaurs and Trolls emerge from it, they might be the perfect thing to have there to reap a terrible toll on them. Now, number 5 I want to talk about is centerpieces. Should a board have a big centerpiece? And honestly, I'm undecided. I think sometimes yes, sometimes no. I don't think it's always going to make a huge difference to gameplay, but at other times it can make a great central objective. I played a second edition game of 40k a year or so ago that had a pyramid type structure, very stepped, that had the main objective on it. And it was quite exciting to see my 5-man Grey Knight squad go toe-to-toe with a couple of dozen of various different types of Tyranid. On the other hand, sometimes it can dominate too much. I think it's one you're going to want to vary from game to game, if I'm honest. The sixth thing that I want to talk about is multi-level boards. I find that a table with multiple levels leads to a much more exciting gaming experience. The recent trend towards gaming mats, especially amongst competitive gamers, has led to a place in which we, as a community, play many of our games on perfectly smooth, flat surfaces. Now, after Ullanor, the Emperor did get the entire planet levelled and paved over for the victory at which he declared Horus his successor. So there is something important about flat spaces in the game. But the flattening didn't happen until after that war was won. I don't think the battles on our table should be perfectly flat either. At the most basic level, that means we need hills. Hills often serve a double purpose. They provide a firing platform for some units and provide cover for others. Sometimes you can use true line of sight for deciding such things, or you can add a layer of abstraction to decide what you're actually doing with them. For example, deciding hills are taller than they look, and you can see over certain terrain whether true line of sight allows it or not. And that actually made a huge difference to the way that hills worked in 4th and 5th edition Warhammer Fantasy. Now in Epic, hills can be a great place to position your Titans to give them a better field of view. And just behind them can be a great place to hide your indirect fire weapons like whirlwinds. Let's be honest, these two towns I've got pictures of here, it's going to be a very different experience to attack each of them, and our gameplay should reflect that. You can do a lot more than just hills, though. One of my favourite games is Necromunda, the old version and the new version. I enjoy the version played on Zone Mortalis boards, like I said, but I've had some fantastic games on more vertical tables. My friend Jack has a huge pair of 6-story tall structures that he and I used to play the old Necromunda on, and they made for a very different style of play. It actually reminded me slightly of the 3D chess you used to see them play on Star Trek. And even with the more common 3-story buildings that came with the basic game, you introduce some very new dynamics to your gameplay, especially when you make sure there's walkways crossing from platform to platform. Another friend of mine made a board inspired by the Judge Dredd movie. The tower block Peach Trees was central to the plot of the movie, and it fundamentally altered the gameplay for us too. We mostly played a version of Afterlife with our own rules on it, breaching from one floor up to the next directly by blasting our way through, sometimes using stairs and elevators, and it's another reason I really wish that game of Afterlife was more popular. Afterlife, by the way, if you haven't heard of it, was a game put out by Anvil Industry, and I think it's the best skirmish scale game that I've played. Whilst Anvil have done really well at making inroads into the 28mm miniatures market, though, I think they found themselves just too small a company to make much impact with that game, which I still think is a real shame. Maybe I'll do a video about Afterlife one day. Now, the other thing we can mention there is Warcry. Warcry is quite a fun game to play, and it's not got as much difference in the levels, but one big part of the gameplay is being able to climb towers and go across the walkways and little bridges connecting the platforms. So, I think that's something Games Workshop are aware of, and I'm hoping the rules that we've got for Imperialis will reflect that too. One thing that I don't know how much other people will care about this is narrative plausibility. I prefer my tables to feel like real places if possible. I like to set my villages up for games of Warhammer Fantasy Battle as if they're actually a little hamlet or a farmstead, rather than just scattering buildings around randomly. It's actually something I've given a lot of thought to in the past, but not quite in the same way I'm thinking about it today. I've had a long-term ambition to build a 28mm scale version of Bow Interchange, which is in East London. I lived close by there for a long time, and it always struck me that if someone wanted to control the movement of men and war material in and out of London, control of that would be a really, really vital spot. I always thought it would make a great table for games of 40k as well, or perhaps Afterlife. Anvil Industry is based pretty close to there after all. Now, Bow Interchange actually has vehicle movement on 3 levels. In the middle, there's a medium-sized roundabout. A 2-lane tunnel runs underneath it, more or less north to south, and a bridge passes above, running from Bow to Stratford, roughly east to west. Next to it and surrounding it, there's a few residential tower blocks, there's some smaller commercial buildings, some industrial buildings, an old canal. There's even a tiny little church, Bow Church. Anyway, I always thought this would be great on a 10 by 5 table. I actually went to the extent of drawing out a map, working it all out, and I've just done the same again to see if maybe this would be a better idea for Imperialis and whether I could make an Imperialis table inspired by bow interchange. But either way, I see some awesome opportunities for using the different levels as ways of outmaneuvering each other, chances for jump troops to make better use of their abilities, and for titans to engage on multiple levels. And whilst the bridge would aid movement in one direction, it would hinder it in the other, and vice versa if you're on a lower level. Definitely something that I would like to see, and I actually tried looking this up. I found a great little setup from a website on a blog called Hot Dice Miniatures. I'd like to do something similar, but maybe even more spectacular. Now, bow interchange has two main arterial roads with a clear area of interest at the centre. It has plenty of buildings, especially around that main junction. Gives a real vibe of authenticity to a table if you did it that way. There's large and small buildings, so different types of infantry, different ways to use it. There's a canal waterway that runs right next to it as well, and that would of course count as a river, and it'd be easy to add a few more bridges over that so it wasn't too restrictive to some types of unit. If I wanted to, it would even be a simple matter to add a section where the canal's been bombed and flooded into a small area, creating a marsh, or simply add an area where the canal widens out like it does a Little Venice. There's loads of wooded land and could connect some of them up together to make the woods a bit more continuous. But anyway, I'm going on a bit too much there. The point is we can try and add some authenticity to our battlefields, and I think that adds something for me. Maybe not so much to the gameplay, but it adds something to the narrative sense of things, which I think is really important. Thinking about things as I've produced this video has really clarified a lot of things for me in my own head. Makes me want to look more carefully at things for my 28mm tables as well. For Horus Heresy and Warhammer Fantasy 5th Edition, I think there might be scope to modify the terrain rules there a little bit to make terrain more than stuff that just gets in the way, at least for some armies. So let me know your thoughts on terrain down below. Let me know if you'd like a video about what companies are out there producing stuff worth considering, and whether you have a favourite company you want to mention. And maybe include ideas about 3D printing your own stuff and STL files and all that sort of thing, because I think that's going to be a huge part of Imperialis for me. For now, though, take care. I'll see you in another video, maybe another one of these. We're going to be recording a Tale of Four Gamers video with Arbiter Ian in a couple of days' time, so that might be out before this. He's a lot quicker at editing than I am. But for now, see you soon. Let's hope that this is the 1st of November. Some people are expecting the big announcement on the 4th of November for a release date. Fingers crossed. Bye.